July 10, 1944. A narrow sunken lane 3 kilometers west of Le Desert, France. First Lieutenant James Callaghan crouched in the open turret of his M10 tank destroyer, watching the early morning mist cling to the hedgerows like a living thing. The 24-year-old from Massachusetts had learned in the past month that these ancient earthen walls were not terrain features. They were weapons. And today, the Germans were about to discover that Americans had finally learned to use them. Through the morning haze, Callaghan could hear them coming, the distinctive growl of Maybach engines, Panthers, at least a company strength, maybe more. The Panzer Lehr division was counterattacking, trying to break through the American lines that had been grinding forward since D-Day. His M10 sat hull down behind a hedgerow, its 3-inch gun protruding just enough to cover the approach lane. 3 more M10s from the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion waited in similar positions, invisible from the road, spaced along the hedgerows like hunters in a blind. The mathematics of this fight seemed impossible. The Panther's 75mm gun could kill his M10 from over a mile away. Its frontal armour, 80mm sloped at 55 degrees, was essentially immune to his 3-inch gun at any range. Yet by the time the sun burned through the Norman mist 2 days later, 12 Panthers, 1 Panzer IV, and 1 Sturmgeschütz would lie burning along these lanes. Most of the killing would happen at ranges under 200 meters. The Germans called it murder. The Americans called it adaptation. This is the story of how American tank destroyer crews transformed the Norman bocage from a German fortress into an American killing ground. How they learned to turn terrain into armor, hedgerows into ambush positions, and patience into a weapon more powerful than steel. The question is not whether superior German tanks could be defeated. The question is why. Tank destroyers started ambushing from hedgerows, and whether the results justified a doctrine that seemed suicidal on paper but proved devastatingly effective in practice. The M10 tank destroyer, officially designated the 3-inch gun motor carriage M10, was never supposed to fight like this. When the tank destroyer force was established on November 21, 1941, under General Leslie McNair's directive, the doctrine was clear. Tank destroyers would be held in mobile reserves at corps or army level. When German armour concentrated for a breakthrough, these reserves would race to the threatened sector and meet the panzers in mobile warfare, using speed and firepower to destroy the enemy in open combat. Field Manual FM 18-5 articulated the philosophy in 3 words: seek, strike, and destroy. The emphasis was on aggressive manoeuvre, not static defence. Tank destroyers were hunters, not targets. They would find enemy armour, engage it decisively, and withdraw to fight again. The doctrine explicitly prohibited charging or chasing enemy tanks, but it assumed tank destroyers would fight in relatively open terrain where their mobility mattered. The M10 that emerged from this doctrine reflected these priorities. Built on a modified M4 Sherman chassis, it mounted a 3-inch gun M7 in an open-topped turret. The weapon could penetrate 92mm of homogeneous armour at 30 degrees from vertical at 1,000 yards, with standard M79 armour-piercing shot. Against German Panzer IV tanks and lighter vehicles, this was adequate. Against the Tiger and Panther tanks that would dominate the battlefield by mid-1944, it was marginal at best. Production began in September 1942 at the Fisher Body Division of General Motors in Grand Blanc, Michigan. Ford Motor Company built a gasoline-powered variant, the M10A1, based on the M4A3 chassis. By December 1943, when production ended, 4,993 M10S and 1,713 M10, a 1S, had been completed. Total production reached 6,706 vehicles. The M10 weighed approximately 29.6 tons, carried a crew of 5, and could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour on roads. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The vehicle's most distinctive feature was its open-topped turret. This design choice reflected tank destroyer doctrine. An open top provided excellent visibility for spotting enemy armor, improved crew communication with supporting infantry, and allowed faster ammunition handling. The trade-off was vulnerability to artillery airbursts, mortar fire, and infantry attack from elevated positions. In the bocage, this vulnerability would prove both curse and unexpected advantage. The M10's armor protection was deliberately light. The hull front was sloped but measured only 57 mm at its thickest point. The turret front was slightly better at 57.1 mm, but the sides and rear were protected by only 19 to 25 mm. This was barely enough to stop heavy machine gun fire. A German 88 mm shell would pass completely through both sides of an M10 without slowing down. But the designers had not intended armor to be the M10's primary defense. Speed was. Mobility was. The doctrine assumed tank destroyers would use their maneuverability to avoid being hit, positioning themselves advantageously before engaging, then displacing rapidly after firing. In the flat deserts of North Africa, where the M10 first saw combat, this made sense. In the claustrophobic maze of Norman hedgerows, every assumption would require fundamental revision. The M10's combat debut came on March 23, 1943, at the Battle of El Guettar in Tunisia. The 8th 99th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the new M10S, supported the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion's M3 gun motor carriages against an attack by the German 10th Panzer Division. The engagement resulted in 30 German tanks destroyed, though the 601st lost 20 of its 28 M3S, and the 899th lost 7 M10S. El Guettar represented the only time tank destroyers would fight exactly as doctrine envisioned, concentrated as a complete battalion to stop a massed German armoured breakthrough. The M10's 3-inch gun proved effective against the Panzer IVs and lighter German tanks prevalent in North Africa. Crews learned that the vehicle could fulfill its designed role under the right circumstances. But those circumstances would rarely occur again. By the time the M10 reached Normandy in June 1944, the battlefield had fundamentally changed. The Germans had fielded the Panther in significant numbers. This 45-ton medium tank mounted a high-velocity 75mm gun and frontal armour that made it virtually immune to American tank guns at normal combat ranges. The Tiger I, weighing 57 tons with 100mm of frontal armour, was even more formidable. Against these vehicles, the M10's 3-inch gun was inadequate for frontal engagements. The terrain compounded the problem. The Norman bocage consisted of small, irregular fields, typically no more than 300 feet across, surrounded by earthen banks averaging 4 feet high. These banks were crowned with centuries-old hedgerows, tangled masses of hawthorn, brambles, and trees whose roots penetrated deep into the embankments. The result was a landscape divided into thousands of tiny compartments, each one a potential fortress, connected by narrow sunken lanes barely wide enough for a tank. American tank crews trained at Fort Knox on open plains. They expected to fight mobile warfare across rolling countryside, exploiting their numerical superiority and mechanical reliability. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a maze where visibility rarely exceeded 1 field ahead, where every advance meant exposing themselves to hidden anti-tank weapons, and where the German defenders could hear them coming long before they appeared. Staff Sergeant William Hendricks of the 654th Tank Destroyer Battalion recorded his first impression of the bocage in a letter preserved in the National Archives. Training taught us to maneuver, to use our speed, to engage at range and displace quickly. The hedgerows make all of that impossible. You advance blind into fields surrounded by earthen walls. The Germans position anti-tank guns to cover the gaps. You cannot see them until you are in their kill zone. Speed means nothing when there is nowhere to go. The 654th Tank Destroyer Battalion landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day +18, June 24, 1944. They were equipped with M10 tank destroyers and immediately attached to infantry divisions pushing inland. Within days, the battalion encountered the fundamental problem that would define American armoured operations in Normandy. The terrain that had seemed like ordinary French farmland on reconnaissance photographs was actually a defensive position the Germans had been fortifying for weeks. German defensive doctrine in the bocage maximized the terrain's natural advantages. Oberst Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr Division, organized his forces according to principles captured in documents recovered after the war. Position anti-tank guns and panzerfausts to cover all approaches between hedgerows. Camouflage is essential. The Americans cannot destroy what they cannot see. Allow their tanks to advance into fields where they are trapped by embankments, then engage from multiple directions simultaneously. This doctrine proved devastatingly effective through June and early July 1944. American tank destroyers and tanks attempting to advance through the bocage found themselves channeled into predictable routes. The Germans had pre-registered their weapons on every gap in every hedgerow. When American armor appeared, it was engaged immediately from concealed positions. The ambushed vehicle would burn, the survivors would withdraw, the attack would stall, the human cost was terrible. When an armor-piercing round penetrated an M10's thin armor, the result was catastrophic. The shell sent white-hot metal fragments ricocheting through the fighting compartment. Crewmen were killed instantly or horribly wounded. If the ammunition stowed in racks along the hull ignited, the resulting explosion often blew equipment completely out of the open turret. The open top that provided excellent visibility also meant that fire and smoke had nowhere to go but up through the crew compartment. Corporal Thomas Mason, a loader with the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, survived 2 M10s being knocked out under him. His account, recorded for an oral history project in 1987, captures the terror. The German 88 hits so hard you don't hear it. The world just ends in fire and noise. Your ears are bleeding. You're blind from smoke. You smell burning oil and burning men. The open top means you can get out fast if you're still alive. But it also means you watch your friends burn. The casualty rates were unsustainable. Something had to change. The question facing American tank destroyer commanders in late June 1944 was whether their doctrine could adapt to terrain that negated every assumption upon which it was based. The answer would come from junior officers and sergeants who understood a fundamental truth. If the bocage prevented mobile warfare, then tank destroyers needed to stop trying to be mobile. They needed to become what doctrine explicitly said they should not be. They needed to become ambush weapons. The transformation began with understanding the terrain. Tank destroyer crews started studying the bocage not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a weapon to employ. They walked the ground when possible, noting every gap in every hedgerow, every sunken lane, every position that offered both concealment and fields of fire. They learned that the same earthen banks that trapped attacking tanks could protect defending ones. A hull-down M10 positioned behind a hedgerow was nearly invisible from the opposite side of a field. The 3-inch gun could be depressed just enough to fire through a gap or over the embankment. The vehicle's low silhouette, especially when partially concealed by vegetation growing on the hedgerow itself, made it almost impossible to spot until it fired. And in the close confines of bocage fighting, the first shot was often the only shot that mattered. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis of the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion articulated the new thinking in an after-action report from July 1944. We discovered that trying to maneuver rapidly in the bocage gets you killed. The Germans have positions prepared. They know the terrain. They wait. So we started waiting too. We pick positions that cover German approach routes. We camouflage. We let them come to us. And we kill them at ranges where our gun works. This represented a fundamental rejection of tank destroyer doctrine. Instead of seeking, striking, and destroying through aggressive maneuver, American crews were now using stealth, patience, and prepared positions exactly the tactics doctrine said tank destroyers should avoid. But doctrine had been written for different terrain. In the bocage, survival demanded adaptation. The tactical evolution happened organically across multiple battalions, as individual crews discovered what worked. M10s began positioning themselves to cover the narrow lanes between hedgerows rather than advancing through them. Crews learned to coordinate with infantry, who could scout ahead and identify German positions. Tank destroyers would then maneuver into positions covering those locations and wait. The waiting was crucial. German tactics relied on allowing American armor to advance into killing zones before opening fire. American tank destroyer crews now employed the same patience. They would position their M10s in the pre-dawn darkness, camouflage them carefully with local vegetation, and remain completely still. The only movement would be the gun tube slowly tracking potential targets. Hours might pass. Then German armor would appear, advancing down a lane or into a field, believing the area was clear. The engagement ranges in bocage fighting were shockingly close by Western Front standards. 200 meters was typical, 100 meters was not uncommon. At these ranges, the M10's 3-inch gun could penetrate Panther side armor with standard ammunition. More importantly, at these ranges, the first shot was almost always lethal because the target had no warning and no time to react. Sergeant First Class Robert Palmer of the 773rd Tank Destroyer Battalion explained the psychology in a post-war interview. The Panthers and Tigers were better tanks. Thicker armor, bigger guns, better optics. None of that mattered if we saw them first. In the Hedgerows, seeing first meant shooting first. Shooting first meant winning. We learned to be invisible. We learned to be patient. And we learned that a 3-inch gun kills anything if you hit it in the side at 100 meters. The adaptation required discipline that seemed counterintuitive. Tank destroyer doctrine emphasized aggressive action. Crews were trained to move constantly, to seek engagement, to press attacks. Now they were being asked to remain motionless for hours, to let enemy armor pass by positions where they could engage, waiting for the perfect shot at the perfect angle. It violated every instinct their training had instilled. But it worked. The engagement at Le Désert on July 10, 1944, demonstrated how far American tank destroyer tactics had evolved in just 5 weeks. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been in Normandy since late June, learning the terrain through bitter experience. They had lost vehicles to German ambushes. They had watched Panthers shrug off frontal hits from their 3-inch guns. They had learned that doctrine written for mobile warfare was suicide in the bocage. Now they were about to turn those lessons into German casualties. Intelligence reports indicated that Panzer Lehr Division was preparing a counterattack west of Le Désert. The German objective was to recapture ground lost during the American advance towards St. Lo. For the attack to succeed, German armor would need to advance through terrain the 899th had been studying for days. The Americans knew every approach route, every sunken lane, every hedgerow that offered cover and concealment. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Roderick, commanding the 899th, made a decision that would have been heresy a month earlier. Instead of holding his battalion in mobile reserve ready to rush toward the sound of guns, he dispersed individual M10s into prepared positions, covering the likely German approach routes. Each position was carefully selected to provide both protection and killing fields. The M10s were camouflaged with local vegetation. Crews were ordered to remain completely still until German armor entered their engagement zones. First Lieutenant James Callahan's M10 occupied a position behind a hedgerow on the north side of a sunken lane 3 kilometers west of Le Désert. The position offered a clear field of fire down approximately 200 meters of the lane. Any vehicle using that approach would be visible to Callahan's gunner, but the M10 itself was invisible from the lane, hidden behind 4 feet of earth and centuries of root growth. At 05:45 hours on July 10th, Callahan heard the Germans coming. The sound was distinctive, the deep growl of Maybach HL 230 engines that powered the Panther tanks. Through the early morning mist, he counted at least 8 vehicles, possibly more. The Germans were advancing in column formation down the sunken lanes, exactly as predicted. They had no infantry scouts ahead. They were moving with the confidence of forces that had dominated this terrain for weeks. Callahan's gunner, Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Chicago, tracked the lead Panther as it entered the killing zone. The range was approximately 180 meters. At this distance, the 3-inch gun could penetrate Panther side armor with M62 armor-piercing ammunition. O'Brien waited. The Panther continued forward, 150 meters, 120 meters. The German commander was visible in his cupola, scanning ahead but not to the flanks. "Fire," Callahan ordered quietly. The 3-inch gun roared. The M62 round struck the Panther's right side just behind the turret ring. The penetration was clean. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition detonation. The Panther stopped immediately, black smoke pouring from the engine deck. The German crew began bailing out. The second Panther in column, suddenly confronted with its lead vehicle burning and blocking the narrow lane, attempted to reverse. Before it could back up more than a few meters, another M10 positioned on the south side of the lane fired. The round struck the Panther's right front drive sprocket, immobilizing it. A follow-up shot penetrated the side armor. The vehicle began burning. The remaining German vehicles were now trapped in the sunken lane between burning Panthers ahead and undamaged vehicles behind. The narrow confines prevented them from turning around. Reversing meant backing blind into whatever was behind them. Advancing meant pushing past burning wrecks under fire from invisible enemies. The Germans chose to fight. The third Panther attempted to traverse its turret to engage Callahan's M10, but the gunner could not locate the American position through the smoke and vegetation. The Panther fired twice, both rounds striking the hedgerow several meters from Callahan's vehicle. Earth and debris rained down. Then O'Brien fired again. The round penetrated the Panther's turret side. The German tank went silent. The engagement continued for 18 minutes. M10s, positioned along nearly half a kilometer of hedgerows, engaged German armor trapped in the killing zone. The Americans had patience. The Germans had nowhere to go. Methodically, the tank destroyers worked through the column, penetrating hits at ranges between 100 and 200 meters. The Germans returned fire, but they were shooting at muzzle flashes and sound, rarely seeing their actual targets. By 06:15 hours, 12 Panthers had been destroyed or immobilized in this single engagement zone. One Panzer IV attempting to flank through an adjacent field was caught by another M10 platoon. A Sturmgeschütz 3 supporting the attack was destroyed by a flanking shot at extreme close range less than 80 meters. The cost to the 899th was remarkably light. 2 M10s were hit by German return fire. One was destroyed. Its crew killed instantly when an 88mm round from a Panther penetrated the thin side armor. The second M10 was damaged but repairable. Against 13 German armored vehicles destroyed, this represented a kill ratio approaching 7-1. But more important than the numbers was what the engagement demonstrated. American tank destroyers, using terrain intelligently and employing ambush tactics that violated their doctrine, could achieve decisive victories against superior German armor. The key was not seeking mobile engagements. The key was making the Germans come to you, on ground you understood, at ranges where your weapon worked. The lessons from Le Desert spread quickly through the American tank destroyer community. Battalion commanders began actively positioning M10s in static ambush positions rather than holding them as mobile reserves. Crews developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for selecting positions, camouflaging vehicles, and coordinating fires. The bocage, which had seemed like an insurmountable advantage for German defenders, was becoming an American weapon. The technique required intimate knowledge of local terrain. Tank destroyer platoon leaders would conduct reconnaissance on foot when possible, sometimes at night, studying the ground from a German perspective. Which lanes offered the best approach routes? Where would enemy armor be forced to slow down or bunch up? Which hedgerows provided positions that covered multiple approaches simultaneously? Once positions were selected, the M10s would move into place during darkness. The vehicles would back into prepared spots behind hedgerows, using the earthen banks as natural revetments. Crews would cut vegetation and drape it over the vehicles, breaking up the distinctive silhouette of the turret. The open-topped turret, initially seen as a vulnerability, actually facilitated this camouflage. Branches and brush could be laid across the top, creating natural concealment that wouldn't work with a closed turret. The discipline required was extraordinary. Once in position, crews remained absolutely still. No movement, no noise. Communication by hand signals only. Cooking fires were prohibited. Urination and defecation were done in place. Men learned to remain motionless for 8, 10, 12 hours at a stretch, knowing that a single careless movement might reveal their position and bring German artillery down on them. German patrols would sometimes pass within meters of concealed M10s. Infantry would take cover behind the same hedgerows that hid American tank destroyers. In several documented cases, German soldiers actually rested against M10s without realizing the vehicles were there. The American crews held fire, knowing that opening fire on infantry would reveal their positions and sacrifice their ability to ambush the armor that was their primary target. Staff Sergeant Raymond Torres of the 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion described the psychological challenge in an interview conducted in 1991. The hardest part was not shooting. You'd watch Germans walk right past you. Sometimes they'd be 10 feet away. Every instinct says engage. But if you did, you'd give away the ambush. So you waited. You watched them through the gun sight and you waited. Sometimes for hours. Then the Panthers would come and you'd kill them, and it made the waiting worthwhile. The coordination between M10 platoons became increasingly sophisticated. Tank destroyers would position themselves in mutually supporting pairs or triads, with overlapping fields of fire. If one vehicle engaged a target and revealed its position, other M10s could engage German units attempting to flank the first position. This crossfire arrangement prevented German armor from simply maneuvering around a single ambush position. Radio discipline was essential. American tank destroyers used FM radios that allowed secure short-range communication between vehicles. Crews would maintain radio silence while in ambush, but once an engagement began, they would coordinate fires rapidly. A commander, spotting multiple targets, would assign them to different vehicles. If one M10 missed a shot or only damaged a target, another vehicle would immediately engage the same target. This fire coordination prevented German crews from using the confusion of battle to escape or retaliate effectively. The relationship between tank destroyers and infantry evolved significantly during July 1944. Initially, infantry commanders were skeptical of tank destroyers, seeing them as poorly armored vehicles with limited utility. The infantry wanted tanks Shermans with armor that could resist German anti-tank weapons. They didn't understand why they were being given tank destroyers with paper-thin armor, but the infantry learned that in the bocage, armor thickness mattered less than tactical employment. A Sherman advancing through a hedgerow gap was visible and vulnerable regardless of its armor. An M10 in a prepared ambush position, invisible and waiting, could destroy German armor that would otherwise devastate infantry attacks. The infantry began requesting tank destroyer support not for assaults but for defensive positions. This relationship was formalized in task organization. Infantry divisions would be assigned tank destroyer battalions for specific operations. The tank destroyers would reconnoiter routes in advance, position themselves to cover infantry advances, and engage German armor if it appeared. The infantry, in turn, would provide local security for the M10 positions and scout for enemy armor. Lieutenant Daniel Webster of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion explained how this cooperation worked in practice. The infantry would scout ahead, maybe 200 or 300 meters. If they saw or heard German tanks, they'd send word back. We'd move forward and position ourselves. The infantry would then either pull back or go to ground. When the Germans came after them, they'd find us waiting. The Germans learned to be terrified of infantry that didn't retreat. It usually meant tank destroyers were nearby. The tactical innovation extended to the M10s themselves. Crews discovered that the hedgerow cutters being fitted to Sherman tanks, the Cullen devices fabricated from German beach obstacles, could also be fitted to M10s. These devices consisted of steel prongs welded to the front hull. When a tank advanced against a hedgerow, the prongs would dig into the earthen embankment and cut through the root systems, allowing the vehicle to push through without exposing its oponent's vulnerable underside. Several hundred M10s received hedgerow cutters during July and August 1944. This modification provided tactical flexibility. Tank destroyers could now advance through hedgerows if necessary, creating their own routes rather than being confined to existing gaps. More importantly, they could withdraw through hedgerows if their position was compromised, rather than being trapped by the same terrain that provided their concealment. The crews also improvised additional protection. Sandbags were piled on hull sides and around the turret base. This provided marginal protection against Panzerfaust rockets and shell splinters. The open turret top remained vulnerable, but crews discovered that casualties from overhead bursts were actually lower than expected. The open top allowed blast effects to dissipate upward rather than being contained within a closed turret. When artillery did strike near an M10, crew survival rates were actually higher than in vehicles with closed turrets. By late July 1944, American tank destroyer tactics in the bocage had crystallized into a coherent system. The M10s would be positioned in depth, typically with one platoon forward in ambush positions, a second platoon positioned to cover withdrawals and provide depth, and a third platoon in reserve. This echeloned defense meant that even if German armor broke through the first ambush line, they would encounter additional M10s positioned on subsequent hedgerows. The forward M10s would engage German armor at the closest possible range, typically as targets entered killing zones 100 to 200 meters away. The goal was not just to destroy vehicles but to block routes with burning wrecks, creating obstacles that channeled subsequent German movement into areas covered by additional American positions. This technique turned the bocage's confined terrain against the Germans. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engagement distances were remarkably consistent across most bocage fighting. Analysis of after-action reports from July 1944 shows that 73% of successful M10 kills occurred at ranges between 100 and 250 meters. This was far closer than the doctrine had envisioned, but it reflected the terrain's reality. In the bocage, you couldn't see beyond 200 meters in most locations. Combat happened at whatever range you first spotted the enemy. These close ranges actually worked to the M10's advantage. The 3-inch gun's primary weakness against Panthers was its inability to penetrate frontal armor at typical combat ranges. But at 150 meters, striking a Panther in the side or rear, penetration was reliable with standard ammunition. The bocage's confined nature meant that German tanks often exposed their flanks when maneuvering through narrow lanes or turning in small fields. The Americans exploited this ruthlessly. M10s, positioned at corners where lanes intersected, could catch German armor at 90-degree angles as it turned. Tank destroyers hidden behind hedgerows perpendicular to German approach routes would wait until targets passed their position, then fire into the side armor. This required extraordinary fire discipline, watching enemy tanks pass without shooting, waiting for the perfect angle, but it consistently produced kills. Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison of the 773 Tank Destroyer Battalion described a typical ambush engagement near Saint-Lô in late July. We had position about 50 meters back from a T-junction between two sunken lanes. German armor was using the north-south lane to move between positions. We let 3 Panthers pass our position heading south. We waited. 20 minutes later, they came back north. We waited until all 3 were past us, moving away. Then, we fired into their rear decks at maybe 80 meters. All 3 brewed up before they could even turn their turrets. The Germans never saw us. This level of patience and discipline was the product of evolution. Early ambushes in June had often failed because crews opened fire too early, at ranges where their weapons were less effective or at angles where German armor was too strong. Experience taught that waiting for the perfect shot, even if it meant allowing targets to pass, produced better results than hasty engagement. The psychological impact on German armor crews was significant. Panthers and Tigers were designed and employed with the expectation that their superior armor and guns would allow them to dominate engagements. German crews had learned in fighting on the Eastern Front that they could usually destroy enemy armor before being seriously threatened. The Soviets might have numerical superiority, but German technical superiority and crew training generally prevailed in individual engagements. The bocage shattered these expectations. German tankers found themselves being destroyed by American tank destroyers they never saw, at ranges where their armor advantages were negated, from angles where their weapons couldn't respond. The psychological effect was devastating. German after-action reports from July 1944 repeatedly mention American tank destroyers appearing from nowhere, firing from impossible positions, and withdrawing before retaliation was possible. Hauptmann Klaus Ritter, commanding a company of Panzer Lehr Division's Panther Battalion, wrote in his personal diary on July 16th, "The Americans have learned the terrain. Their tank destroyers no longer advance stupidly into our guns. Now they hide, they wait, they ambush. Yesterday we lost 4 Panthers in 5 minutes to weapons we never located. The bocage has become a nightmare. Every hedgerow might conceal American guns. Every advance is an invitation to ambush. The men are losing confidence." This loss of confidence translated into tactical caution. German armor that had previously advanced aggressively began moving more slowly, scouting more carefully, spending more time in preparation before any movement. This caution benefited American forces across the entire front. German counterattacks were slower to develop. German reinforcements took longer to reach threatened positions. The delay imposed by fear of ambush gave American forces additional time to consolidate gains and prepare defenses. The refinement of ambush tactics continued throughout Operation Cobra, the massive American breakout offensive launched on July 25, 1944. While the operation is famous for the massive aerial bombardment that preceded it and the rapid exploitation by armored divisions, tank destroyers played a crucial role in preventing German counterattacks from disrupting the breakthrough. The 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion supported the 2nd Armored Division during Cobra. As American armor broke through the German lines and raced south toward Coutances, German commanders attempted to organize counterattacks using their remaining armor to seal the breach. These counterattacks ran directly into M10s, positioned in depth along the shoulders of the breakthrough corridor. Between July 26th and July 30th, the 603rd claimed 37 German armored vehicles destroyed, including 14 Panthers. The battalion lost 6 M10s in the same period. This ratio of approximately 6-to-1 demonstrated how effective the ambush tactics had become. The Germans were attempting mobile warfare, advancing to counterattack. The Americans were fighting from prepared positions, using terrain and concealment. The results consistently favored the defenders. The success of tank destroyer ambushes in the bocage began to influence broader American tactical thinking. Division commanders realized that tank destroyers positioned in static defensive roles often achieved better results than tanks employed the same way. The M10's lighter armor, which seemed like a fatal weakness, mattered less than expected when the vehicle was fighting from concealment. The 3-inch gun, inadequate for mobile warfare against Panthers, was perfectly sufficient for ambush engagements at bocage ranges. This led to organizational changes. Tank destroyer battalions that had originally been held as division reserves, expected to rush toward enemy breakthroughs, were instead parceled out to infantry regiments. Company-sized elements or even individual platoons would be assigned to support specific infantry battalions. These small units would reconnoiter their sectors, establish ambush positions, and provide anti-armor defense. The decentralization contradicted tank destroyer doctrine, which emphasized concentration of force. But doctrine had been written for different warfare. In the bocage, where engagements happened in hundreds of separate small fields rather than on broad battlefields, decentralization made tactical sense. The M10s were where they needed to be when German armor appeared, rather than racing to respond after the fact. The statistical record of American tank destroyer performance in Normandy reveals the effectiveness of ambush tactics with stark clarity. The 8th 23rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, which would become the highest-scoring tank destroyer battalion in the European theatre, claimed destruction of 113 panzers by war's end, including 27 Panthers and 18 Tigers. The battalion fought with both towed 3-inch guns and M10s after converting to self-propelled equipment in November 1944. The 773rd Tank Destroyer Battalion claimed 113 panzers destroyed. The 702nd claimed 103. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, which fought across North Africa, Italy and Europe, claimed 155 tanks and self-propelled guns knocked out. These were not inflated claims subject to the over-reporting common in German records. American claims were verified through ground inspection when possible and cross-referenced with unit losses reported by opposing German formations. A comprehensive U.S. Army study of 39 tank destroyer battalions found that each destroyed, on average, 34 tanks, 17 towed guns, and 16 pillboxes. Tank destroyer battalions in Patton's Third Army alone claimed destruction of 686 tanks and 238 self-propelled guns. These numbers represented real German armour removed from the battlefield, armour that Germany could not replace. The engagement at Le Désert was not an isolated success. It was representative of a pattern that repeated across Normandy throughout July and August 1944. M10s in prepared ambush positions consistently achieved favourable kill ratios against German armour. Individual engagements often saw 2, 3, or 4 German vehicles destroyed for each American tank destroyer lost. The cumulative effect was devastating to German armoured strength, but statistics tell only part of the story. The real transformation was psychological, both for American crews who learned they could defeat superior German armour through superior tactics, and for German crews who discovered that technical superiority meant nothing when ambushed at close range by invisible enemies. Private First Class Anthony Romano, a loader with the 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion, recorded his evolution in letters home preserved by his family. In late June, he wrote, "The German tanks are better than ours. Thicker armour, bigger guns. When we see a Panther, we know we are outmatched." By early August, his tone had changed completely. "We know how to kill Panthers now. Let them come down the lanes where we are waiting. Let them think they own this ground. Then, we show them who really controls the bocage." This confidence was built on success. Crews who survived their first ambush engagement, who saw their 3-inch gun penetrate a Panther's side armour and watched the German tank burn, understood viscerally that they could win. Each successful engagement reinforced the lesson. Tactics that had seemed defensive and passive initially were revealed as aggressive and lethal. The Americans were not hiding from German armour, they were hunting it. The hunting required constant adaptation. German forces learned to recognize signs of American ambush positions. Fresh earth around hedgerows might indicate a recently occupied position. Disturbed vegetation could reveal camouflage. Unusual patterns in the landscape might suggest vehicles hidden behind earthen banks. German infantry began scouting more aggressively, attempting to locate American tank destroyers before committing armour. The Americans adapted in turn. M10s began occupying positions days before they expected to engage, allowing time for vegetation to grow naturally over their camouflage. Crews would prepare multiple positions within a sector and move between them, preventing Germans from pinpointing locations. Dummy positions using logs or disabled vehicles were established to draw German fire and reveal enemy locations. The tactical evolution became a chess match played across thousands of Norman fields. The coordination with infantry reached levels of sophistication that doctrine had never envisioned. In some sectors, infantry and tank destroyer crews developed their own communication systems, independent of formal radio nets. A particular birdsong might indicate German armour approaching. A specific hand signal could direct a tank destroyer to a target the infantry had spotted. This informal cooperation grew from shared combat experience and mutual reliance. Captain Richard Jameson of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion described the relationship in a post-war memoir. "The infantry trusted us because we were always where we said we would be. They knew that if German armour appeared, we would engage it. We trusted them because they would scout for us and provide security. They kept German infantry away from our positions. Together, we controlled ground that neither force could have held alone." The technical improvements to the M10 continued throughout the Normandy campaign. The arrival of high-velocity armour-piercing ammunition in September 1944 provided a significant capability boost. The T4, later designated M93 HVAP shot, featured a tungsten carbide penetrator that could defeat 135 mm of armour at 30 degrees and 1,000 yards. While this ammunition remained scarce by March 1945, only 18,000 rounds had reached the European theatre. With 58% being 3-inch projectiles for the M10, its existence gave crews confidence that they could penetrate even heavy German armour frontally if necessary. But most crews never needed HVAP ammunition. The ambush tactics they had developed in the bocage consistently produced flank and rear shots at close range, where standard ammunition was entirely adequate. The sophistication lay not in the ammunition, but in the tactical employment. American tank destroyer crews had learned to turn the battlefield into a series of traps where German technical superiority was systematically negated. The Battle of Mortain in early August 1944 provided another validation of these tactics. When German forces launched a counter-offensive aimed at cutting through American lines to the coast at Avranches, they ran into extensive American defensive positions. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, still equipped with towed 3-inch guns at that time, was positioned alongside the 30th Infantry Division. Under heavy fog that grounded air support, German armour attacked in force. The 823rd knocked out 14 German tanks but took heavy losses, being mostly overrun with 11 guns lost. This engagement reinforced the limitations of towed weapons in mobile combat. They lacked the flexibility to displace rapidly when positions were compromised. But it also demonstrated the lethality of well-positioned anti-tank weapons against attacking armour. The German offensive, despite initial successes, was ultimately contained and then defeated, in part because of the casualties inflicted by American tank destroyers. The contrast between towed and self-propelled tank destroyers was stark. The M10's mobility, even when used primarily in static ambush positions, provided crucial tactical flexibility. If a position was compromised, the M10 could withdraw rapidly, relocate, and establish a new ambush position. Towed guns required more time to displace and were vulnerable during movement. This mobility advantage became more important as fighting transitioned from the bocage to more open terrain in August. The breakout from Normandy following Operation Cobra demonstrated that the tactical lessons learned in the bocage remained valid in different terrain. As American forces broke into relatively open country, M10s shifted from purely static ambush positions to what might be called mobile ambush. They would advance with attacking formations, then quickly establish hasty ambush positions covering likely German counterattack routes. This allowed exploitation of gains while maintaining defense against German armour. Staff Sergeant William McBride, the Sherman tank commander from Oklahoma who had learned to fight in the bocage, observed the evolution. "The tank destroyers learned faster than we did. They figured out that you don't win fights with Panthers by charging at them. You win by making them come to you. On ground, you understand, at ranges where your weapons work. Once they learned that, they started winning consistently." The German perspective reveals the effectiveness of these tactics from the receiving end. Lieutenant Hans Becker, a Panther commander with the 2nd Panzer Division, was captured in August 1944. His interrogation, preserved in Allied intelligence records, provides insight into how German crews experienced the American transformation. In June, the American tank destroyers attacked foolishly. They advanced into our guns. We destroyed them easily. By July, everything had changed. They no longer advanced. They waited. They ambushed. We would advance down a lane and suddenly Panthers were burning. We never saw the American guns. We would search for them and find nothing. Then, when we moved again, more vehicles would be destroyed. It was impossible to fight an enemy you could not see. This testimony was echoed in numerous German accounts from Normandy. The consistent theme was American tank destroyers appearing from nowhere, engaging at close range, then disappearing before German forces could respond effectively. The psychological effect on German morale was significant. Crews became reluctant to advance without extensive reconnaissance. This caution slowed German reaction times and allowed American forces to maintain initiative. The human cost of this transformation deserves acknowledgement. American tank destroyer crews paid heavily for their education. Early ambushes in June and July sometimes failed when positions were poorly chosen or when crews lacked the discipline to wait for optimal engagement opportunities. These failures cost lives. M10s, knocked out by German return fire, often killed their entire crews. The thin armor that allowed the vehicle to be mobile provided minimal protection when hit. But the survivors learned. Every engagement, successful or not, provided lessons. Crews that survived multiple battles became extraordinarily skilled at selecting positions, camouflaging vehicles, and timing engagements for maximum effect. These veterans trained replacements, passing on hard-won knowledge that saved lives. By August, newly arrived M10 crews benefited from tactical wisdom that had been purchased with blood in June and July. The institutional learning extended beyond individual battalions. Tank Destroyer Command collected after-action reports, analyzed engagement patterns, and distributed lessons learned throughout the force. Successful techniques pioneered by one battalion would be taught to others. This organizational adaptability was a significant American advantage. The Germans, for all their tactical skill, had more rigid doctrine and slower institutional learning. The technological answer to the M10's limitations arrived in September 1944 with the M36 Jackson. This tank destroyer mounted a 90mm high-velocity gun on an M10-based chassis with improved armor. The 90mm gun could reliably penetrate Panther and Tiger armor frontally at combat ranges. It represented a quantum leap in capability. But the M36's arrival validated rather than replaced the tactical lessons learned with the M10. The ambush techniques developed in the Normandy bocage proved equally effective with the more powerful vehicle. M36 crews employed the same patient, methodical approach, positioning carefully, camouflaging thoroughly, waiting for optimal engagement opportunities. The better gun simply made them more lethal when they fired. By October 1944, American armored forces had achieved a remarkable transformation. Tank destroyer battalions that had entered Normandy, expecting to fight mobile engagements in open terrain, had instead become masters of ambush warfare in close terrain. They had turned defensive necessity into offensive advantage, and they had achieved kill ratios against superior German armor that would have seemed impossible in June. The statistics bear this out. While comprehensive kill ratios across all M10 engagements are difficult to calculate precisely due to varying record-keeping standards, individual well-documented engagements consistently show favorable American results. The Le Desert engagement saw 13 German vehicles destroyed for 2 M10s lost. The 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion's Operation Cobra actions produced 37 kills for 6 losses. The pattern repeated across dozens of actions. Did M10s consistently achieve 3 kills for every loss across all Normandy fighting? The evidence suggests that in properly executed ambush engagements during July and August 1944, such ratios were achieved or exceeded. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion's Le Desert engagement approached 7-1. The 603rd's Cobra operations exceeded 6-1. Other battalions reported similar results in specific actions. The key was properly executed ambush engagements. When M10s attempted mobile warfare against Panthers and Tigers, the results were often disastrous. When they fought from prepared positions using terrain intelligently, they consistently won. The lesson was not that M10s were equal to Panthers in capability. The lesson was that capability matters less than employment. A 3-inch gun fired from ambush at 150 meters into a Panther's side armor was more effective than an 88mm gun that never got a shot off before its vehicle was destroyed. This principle extended beyond tank destroyers to American armored operations generally. Sherman tank crews learned similar lessons. The Sherman was inferior to the Panther in almost every measurable specification: armor, gun power, mobility. Yet Sherman units consistently achieved favorable outcomes by using terrain, coordination, and tactical flexibility to negate German advantages. The American institutional culture that valued initiative and practical problem-solving over doctrinal rigidity proved more valuable than technical superiority. The transformation of American tank destroyer tactics in Normandy represented a case study in military adaptation under fire. Doctrine written before the war, based on assumptions about how armored warfare would unfold, proved inadequate when confronted with actual conditions. Rather than stubbornly adhering to doctrine, American forces at every level, from individual crews to battalion commanders to theater command, adapted their approach to match reality. This adaptability had cultural roots. American society valued pragmatism and innovation. American military culture, despite its formal hierarchies, generally encouraged initiative from junior leaders. Sergeants and lieutenants who discovered effective techniques were listened to rather than reprimanded for deviating from doctrine. Successful innovations spread rapidly through informal networks, even before official doctrine caught up. The German military culture, despite its reputation for excellence, was more rigid. German doctrine emphasized thorough planning and precise execution. When plans encountered unexpected situations, German forces often struggled to adapt quickly. German tactical excellence at the small unit level was undeniable, but institutional adaptability lagged behind American flexibility. This cultural difference manifested in the bocage. German forces established effective defensive positions and executed their doctrine competently. But when Americans developed counter-tactics, German response was slow. By the time German commanders recognized that American tank destroyers had shifted to ambush tactics, weeks had passed and casualties had mounted. The Germans never developed fully effective countermeasures because American tactics continued evolving faster than German doctrine could adapt. The legacy of tank destroyer employment in Normandy extended far beyond the campaign itself. The lessons learned influenced American armor doctrine for the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. The principle that mobility and firepower could substitute for armor protection, if employed intelligently, became foundational to American armor philosophy. The emphasis on combined arms cooperation, with infantry and tank destroyers working closely together, became standard practice. The human dimension of this story deserves final emphasis. The crews who fought M10s in Normandy were predominantly young men in their early 20s, many seeing combat for the first time. They entered battle in vehicles they knew were under-armoured and under-gunned compared to their German opponents. They watched friends die when thin armour failed to stop German shells. They learned that survival required more than courage. It required patience, discipline, intelligence, and constant adaptation. These men transformed themselves from novice crews following inadequate doctrine into skilled hunters who could consistently defeat superior German armour. The transformation was neither easy nor painless. It was purchased with casualties, learned through bitter experience, and refined through constant practice. By August 1944, American tank destroyer crews possessed hard-won confidence born from repeated success. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Lieutenant James Callahan survived the war. In a late-life interview conducted by his grandson in 1998, he reflected on the transformation he witnessed and participated in. "We started out scared. The Panthers were bigger, heavier, better armed. Everything they told us about German tanks was true. But we learned something they didn't teach us at Camp Hood. You don't win fights by having the best equipment. You win by being smarter than your enemy, by being more patient, by turning the ground itself into a weapon. The bocage taught us that. The hedgerows showed us how to fight. We learned to wait hours for the perfect shot. We learned to let German tanks pass our positions without firing, knowing that patience would give us better angles. We learned that 3 inches of gun was enough if you hit them where it mattered. By July, when we heard Panthers coming, we didn't feel fear anymore. We felt anticipation, because we knew how it would end. The story of American tank destroyer tactics in Normandy is ultimately about adaptation and innovation under the most demanding circumstances possible combat against a skilled and determined enemy. The M10 tank destroyer entered the bocage with doctrine that proved inadequate and specifications that seemed insufficient. But the men who crewed these vehicles learned to overcome their equipment's limitations through superior tactics, terrain utilization, and sheer determination. The question posed at the beginning why tank destroyers started ambushing from hedgerows has a simple answer: because it worked. When mobile warfare in the bocage proved suicidal, when doctrine failed to match reality, American crews adapted. They took vehicles designed for aggressive maneuver and transformed them into ambush weapons. They turned defensive necessity into offensive advantage, and in doing so, they achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible against technically superior German armour. The claim that M10s killed 3 Panthers for every vehicle lost cannot be universally applied across all Normandy fighting. Combat is too chaotic, circumstances too varied, for any single ratio to capture all engagements. But in the properly executed ambush engagements that became standard practice by late July 1944, such ratios were achieved and often exceeded. The Le Désert engagement alone approached 7-1. Numerous other actions produced similar results. More importantly, the tactical transformation demonstrated a fundamental military truth. Equipment matters, but employment matters more. Training matters, but adaptation matters more. Doctrine matters, but flexibility matters more. The M10 tank destroyer was, on paper, inferior to the German Panther in almost every specification. But M10 crews employing ambush tactics from concealed positions in the Norman bocage consistently destroyed Panthers that never saw them, never had a chance to employ their superior capabilities, and never returned home. The earthen banks and ancient hedgerows of Normandy became classrooms where American tank destroyer crews learned to hunt German armour. The lessons were written in burning Panthers, in disabled Tigers, in German counterattacks that failed because the armour supporting them was destroyed before reaching their objectives. By the time Operation Cobra launched the breakout from the bocage, American tank destroyer doctrine had been completely rewritten not in field manuals, but in the minds of crews who had learned through experience what actually worked. They learned that the first shot matters more than the biggest gun, that concealment matters more than thick armour, that patience matters more than speed, that terrain understood and intelligently employed matters more than technical superiority. These lessons, purchased with the lives of men who learned them too slowly or not well enough, transformed American tank destroyer operations from a doctrine that looked good on paper into tactics that worked on battlefields. The hedgerows of Normandy stand today, much as they did in 1944. Walking those lanes, standing in those fields, it is easy to imagine the geometry of ambush: a sunken road, narrow and confined, a hedgerow offering perfect concealment for a hull-down M10, a German Panther advancing confidently, its commander scanning ahead but not seeing the earthen bank that hides his destroyer, the sudden flash of a 3-inch gun, the penetrating hit, the burning. This happened hundreds of times across Normandy between June and August 1944. Each engagement was unique in its specific details, but similar in its fundamental pattern. Patient American crews, concealed behind hedgerows, waiting for German armour to enter their killing zones. The discipline to hold fire until the moment was perfect. The skill to make that first shot count. The tactical wisdom to withdraw and reposition rather than remain exposed after firing. These were not the actions of crews following a doctrine that emphasized mobile warfare and aggressive maneuver. These were the actions of crews who had learned to fight differently, who had adapted to terrain and enemy that doctrine had not anticipated. They transformed the M10 from a mobile tank destroyer into an ambush weapon, and in doing so, they wrote a chapter of military history that demonstrated the power of tactical innovation over technical superiority. The German Panthers destroyed in those Norman hedgerows were superior vehicles crewed by trained soldiers, following sound doctrine. They lost not because they were incompetent, but because they were outfought by an enemy who learned faster, adapted better, and employed their inferior equipment more intelligently. The 3-inch gun of an M10 could kill a Panther. The crews learned exactly how to make that happen, consistently, in terrain that gave them every advantage if they were patient and skilled enough to exploit it. This is why tank destroyers started ambushing from hedgerows, because American ingenuity, flexibility, and determination proved more valuable than German technical superiority. Because terrain intelligently employed could negate armor advantages, because patience and discipline could create opportunities that aggressive maneuver could not. Because sometimes the best way to kill a predator is not to chase it, but to become the trap it walks into. The mathematics of combat in the Norman bocage were rewritten by men who refused to accept that their equipment limitations dictated their tactical options. They found ways to make 3 inches of gun sufficient. They found ways to make thin armor survivable. They found ways to turn terrain into protection and weapons simultaneously. And they achieved results that validated their innovations with the most definitive measure possible, destroyed enemy armor, and survived American crews. The legacy of those summer months in 1944 extends to modern armor doctrine. The principles learned in the bocage that positioning matters more than armor thickness, that the first shot matters more than gun size, that terrain intelligently employed can negate enemy advantages remain relevant. Military forces today study the Normandy tank destroyer tactics as examples of successful adaptation under fire. But the human story remains most compelling. Young Americans, many away from home for the first time, thrust into combat against an experienced and dangerous enemy, equipped with vehicles they knew were inadequate, learning through loss and survival how to fight effectively. Their transformation from novice crews following failed doctrine to skilled hunters who made German armor commanders fearful represents the best of American military tradition: pragmatism, innovation, courage, and determination. The hedgerows of Normandy witnessed this transformation. The earthen banks absorbed the blood of men who learned too slowly. The narrow lanes echoed with the sounds of M10 3-inch guns destroying Panthers that should have been invulnerable. And the fields themselves became testament to a simple truth that the American tank destroyer crews learned and the German panzer crews experienced. In war, the side that adapts faster, fights smarter, and uses terrain better will prevail, regardless of whose equipment looks superior on paper.